Hi everyone. Well, we are starting our series into the books of 1 and 2 Peter this week, and we're going to look at the first chunk of 1 Peter. But I thought first good to do a bit of an introduction to the book and to maybe flesh out the nature of challenge that this particular church is experiencing and the reason for, obviously, for Peter's writing a letter to them. So this video might be a bit longer than the ones that follow later in the series. So 1 Peter is a letter written to a group of Christians who are under increasing pressure from the culture and the society around them. Their faith in God and their Christian lifestyles are leading to a level of isolation and confrontation and wariness in their Christian walk. And so when we read the text, as you have done, if you've worked through your workbook, we know that they're operating in hostile territory. And there are a couple of clues within the text which explain more about the nature of that challenge. Now, when I think about persecution, I think of martyrdom. I think of Christians being dragged out of a prayer meeting and stoned in the town centre. And while that has for sure been the case for communities in the past, I don't get the sense that that is the nature of the challenge that these churches are facing. Although whatever the context is, it's clearly leading to personal and communal challenges within their church. And so as we read right up front, Peter calls them exiles and he talks about their various trials. But quite quickly, he moves into calling them to holy living and to avoiding what he calls the passions of your former ignorance and the futile ways handed down to you. It's as if their behavior is actually part of the problem. Their compromise is compounding the situation. And so if we connect the dots, I would put it to you that the challenges that they're facing are more about maintaining faithful obedience to God in a context, in a culture that rewards independence and self-interest and hedonism. And if that sounds at all familiar, then going through 1 Peter should be a helpful exercise for our church. Because I believe that is the nature of our society. We're increasingly at odds with cultural flows. Now, by way of example, while typing up this very summary, I got a call from our electrician. He's been doing some extra jobs since the house build around the property. And he was tallying up the list of costs incurred so far. And he got to the end of it and he said, "Okay, mate, well, that's a total of $4,300. But if you can do it for cash, then I can do it for $3,900." And I'm sure if you have had any work done for your home, you may have been in the same position, because it's not the first time I've had a conversation like this. And so we can call it maybe the carrot and stick of sin. It's a combination of temptation and coercion. That's what our culture tries to disciple us with. It tempts us with things, and then if we don't take the temptation, then it coerces us into them. And so in my case, the carrot is a payoff for handing over that envelope of cash. I stand to save $400, and it's just dangling in front of me, and no one else knows until I made a video and put it on the internet. And if I insist that we follow the legal protocol, then I get the annoyance of a tradie who doesn't want to do that. He wants cash in hand. He doesn't want to declare that money. He doesn't want to do the paperwork surrounding that payment. And so no one's watching, and everyone except the ATO stands to gain if we do the envelope of cash. But if I choose the high road, we all pay a price. And so my values, my Christian inclinations are putting me at odds with the prevailing cultural norms. That's a very tame example. I'm not suggesting that is the extent of the battle that these churches were facing, but I think it paints a helpful picture of how culture tempts us and coerces us to compromise. And so I think this is the case for this audience. Their convictions are being challenged. They're starting to maybe glance back at the activities of their past, or maybe looking around and recognizing just how easy it is sometimes to compromise. They may have been wondering if it's all worth it. Is it not worth just bending every now and then and compromising? Or is it simply better to go with the flow, better to follow their flesh, live in the moment, seek comfort and harmony with the world? And so, off the bat, Peter calls churches to lift their gaze. He calls them to recognize the temporary nature of these temptations, but the eternal nature of the fruit of obedience. Now, you may also feel some pressure in your day-to-day life. You may have pragmatic family members. Now, you may also be feeling the pressure in your everyday life. You may have pragmatic family members who are questioning the amount of time and effort you put into church life, maybe at the expense of family activities. Or you may find yourself on the wrong side of some hot topics discussed in the media, or excluded from a crowd at work because you shy away from gossiping or off-color jokes, or you refuse to say nasty things about your spouse while you're all chatting in the office. You're being at risk of being called a fanatic, or maybe being called out of touch, or just standing out in general because of your faith. You may feel that your faith is a burden, or that it puts you at risk of ridicule or getting cancelled in today's terms. And so what would God say to a people in this predicament? What would God have us look to for our security? How would he have us act and respond in an environment like this? How would God pastor us through a season? And here we have Peter's letter written to churches in this very situation. And so I think very helpful to us as we evaluate our responses to the continued rub of our faith against modern day Australian culture. So today we're looking at 1 Peter 1:1 to 2:3, and we're just going to work through the text. We're going to see what Peter says, and we're going to do the same next week through the next chunk. I think it's helpful to break it into three parts, this particular portion. There's a bit of an introduction, a foundation, if you will, and then Peter gets practical on two issues. One is the need for holy lifestyles, and the second is the need for unity and community in the church. And I think it's quite important to recognize that these are the first things he gets to in this letter. So where does he start? What is the point of departure to counsel a church through the season? How would you begin a text to a friend, maybe a friend who's part of a footy club and is being tempted to live a different way by his teammates? Or maybe to a friend who's stopped coming to church meetings because his marriage is on the rocks? What is the foundation of our faithful obedience? What would God have us bed down first in order to live out this life of obedience in a caustic environment? So as I read it, Peter's opening foray is an assault on our feelings of fragility before the Lord. You see, the cultural pressure we face leads to compromise in our lives. And compromise leads to guilt, and guilt leads to fear and shame, and fear that maybe we're falling away from God. Once compromised, we begin to wonder if we can even run this race, and if it's worth even trying. You see, the people that Peter's writing to are God-fearing Christ followers, just like us. They're eager to be obedient, but they're starting to feel the pinch. They're beginning to doubt God's grace and the resilience of their salvation, as maybe they start to slip and compromise in different areas. It made me think of Peter's own experience stepping out the boat as Jesus called him onto the water. And facing pressure like Peter, we start to look at the waves. When we feel under pressure from culture, we start to look away from God. We start to look to our own wisdom, our own sensibilities. We trust our own sensibilities instead of God's commands. We trust our own wisdom instead of God's wisdom, and our own instincts instead of God's design for life and godliness. We start to think, when we start to sink, we start thinking, we start to doubt whether it's even possible and whether we should just throw in the towel and go with the flow, and whether we'll ever be able to measure up to God's standard for obedience. It demotivates us. And so I sense that Peter's trying to just wipe that fragility off the table with his first act. And he's trying to reset our perspective. He's trying to frame these temporary trials in the bigger picture. In the first two sentences of the letter, he lays out the origin of our redemption. He says, "The Father has overseen our salvation. He foreknew that you would be part of the elect. He drew us to himself." And the only reason we have a relationship with God is Jesus' blood shed for us. And now the Spirit, God's power in us, is at work sanctifying us, leading us to holiness. And then in a few verses, he'll tell us that our faith is guarded by God's power, and that our inheritance is imperishable, undefiled, unfading. Even in our stumbling and in our compromise in these moments, we're not at risk. Our place in eternity is secure. The group he's writing to is just like us. They love the Lord, they love his word, they have an affection for God, but their circumstances are starting to affect their behavior. And they're drawing out human responses from them. And it's creating tension, evidently, in the church. They've lost their first love. They're feeling a sense of conviction and shame as they experience doubts about their ability to endure and remain faithful. They're sinking into the waves. And Peter says, no, that is a small view of God, and it's a small view of the work that he's already done in your life. Your place in the kingdom is not under threat. Your presence in God's kingdom is by his grace and sacrifice. And it's not yours to lose. In verse 3 he says, according to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that's imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. It's being kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith, for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, from that first two verses, have brought you to this place. He's saying, you didn't get here by yourself, and they are going to bring you home. Verse 6 says, though now for a little while you have been grieved by various trials, in light of that security and that eternal perspective, let's get practical and let's look at some of the issues at hand. God's grace to us is scandalous, and every time we stop and we express this and we read these verses, it's shocking. It's so counter to what we are familiar with. But it has to be the foundation upon which we build our lives of obedience. Because we can act in a certain way for a while, but ultimately it's going to come down to our motivations. And if it's really just internal and it's us trying to measure up to a standard, we're going to fall very quickly. We're going to become demotivated. And so he's starting with the foundation that he knows. So he's starting with the foundation because he knows that in order to see the present challenges in eternal light, we need to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And so in verse 13 he says, okay, therefore, prepare your minds for action and be sober-minded, which is a phrase that comes up quite often. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Take your eyes off the challenges, set your eyes on the grace that is waiting for you. And then he goes on to two things. Number one, he talks about the need for holy lifestyles. So Peter clearly has a big view of God. He's labored the point in that first bit. God drew us in, God redeemed us, and God is sanctifying us. And God's keeping our eternity locked up safe for us in heaven. And so our actions don't earn God's grace, but God's grace should motivate actions in our lives. And so in these verses, he's emphasizing that Holiness matters in this environment because this is a church in a unique state of challenge. And maybe in another world, they would have liked a letter that said, just lie low, guys. Don't rock the boat. That's not Peter's priority. His comfort is not his priority. Relief is not his priority. Holy living is a priority. It's at the top of his list. Not just a holy state of mind. It needs to translate into a holy way of life. Verse 14, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. What we say, what we do, what we're willing to stand up for, what we're willing to sacrifice, what we take responsibility for, it all matters. We are God's people, and so we should live like him. Verse 16 says, be holy, for I am holy. In our day, I increasingly see there's like a hyper-liberal stream of Christianity, which I think is trying to find a point of harmony between our faith lifestyles and the world's values. It says you can be a bit less prudish, you can be a bit less conservative, you can be less obedient to Scripture, treat it as a guideline. And it's a view that makes much of the grace of God, but it neglects this call to mirroring Jesus' life. It's a free pass to follow our passions. It's way more palatable to society because our lives become indistinguishable from society, other than this kind of cerebral, philosophical affection we hold for God. And so in that view, you can divorce your wife if you're not happy. You can allow your sexual impulses to direct your decision making. You can drink too much, you can speak your mind, you can sleep around, you can wield your power freely in your day-to-day life, as long as you have this philosophical love and affection for God. But it's garbage, and Peter says so. In verse 17 he says, if you call on him as Father, conduct yourselves with fear throughout your exile, throughout this period of challenge. Conduct yourself with fear, knowing that you've been ransomed from your futile ways, and that ransom price was big. How we live in these times matters. It's where we used to say in South Africa, it's where the tacky hits the tarmac. Tacky is another word for sports shoe. It's that contact point. Our lifestyles and our actions are the contact point with culture. And so, why does this holiness matter? Is it just about obedience to God? Or is there something else there? And the short answer is the same as it's been since God put his finger on Abraham's family. Since he established the nation of Israel to be a sign to the people around them of his glory. Our ministry is at stake because of our lifestyles and our holiness. Mission is at stake. And we're going to get to that more in time to come. But just thinking back to the first example, when our electrician connects the dots and he sees me, maybe even deliver a message at church, or he recognizes me in church, or he comes to know that I'm part of a church, but he also remembers me handing over that envelope of cash. In that moment, he's going to battle to reconcile the truth of what I'm saying and what I'm advocating with my lifestyle. The second thing Peter gets to, and again, worth noting that it comes up really early in his letter, is the issue of unity and community within the church. He says, verse 22, having purified your souls by obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, you must love one another earnestly from a pure heart. In chapter 2:1 he says, put away all deceit, hypocrisy, envy and slander, because those are the enemy of unity within the church. And so I can only speculate about what was going on in the church at the time. Evidently they had some friction within the membership. But I think what we can say with assurance is that unity within the church becomes even more important in times of pressure and challenge. The love and the care that are from each other is part of God's provision to us. Peter writes this letter hoping that these churches would have grace and peace. And part of that prescription is that they would have unified churches where we can support and care for each other in these times. Now, recognizing that if you've spent more than a few years in a church, you'll probably have been disappointed at some point, let down by people, let down by the very people that Peter's prescribing as this ointment to our souls. And more than that, society celebrates independence, and the kind of digitization of our lives has isolated us. And yet, Peter says a sincere love for the church and its people is fundamental to our resilience. And we see Paul talking about this a lot as well. A unified church allows us the full experience of grace and peace. And so unity of the church is worth fighting for, but as you know, and as we will no doubt have to lean into in future, it requires an earnest commitment to make it happen. So that brings us to the end of this initial piece of scripture. And next week we'll continue with the next. But yeah, I trust it's helpful to think about some of the similarities between the people that Peter's writing to and our own situation. And I look forward to chatting more on Thursday as we dive into the Word and have a bit more discussion time. Cheers.